My name is Blair. I'm in my late 30s now, and for most of my adult life, I've been someone people describe with words like steady, dependable, and low maintenance. I've worked in rooms where decisions were made quietly, where power didn't announce itself, and where the loudest voice wasn't always the one that mattered. I've also been the kind of person others assumed would always be there, useful, composed, and not particularly demanding of attention. People tend to underestimate me, not in a dramatic way, more in a comfortable way. The kind of underestimation that comes from assuming someone is fine because they don't complain, that they don't notice because they don't react. I've been mistaken for someone who doesn't keep score, who doesn't remember the small moments, who doesn't understand how systems work beneath the surface. I let that perception exist for a long time because it made my life quieter. And quiet, for me, felt safer than confrontation. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about exposing villains or celebrating a dramatic downfall. It's about something subtler. How power shifts when you stop explaining yourself. How clarity forms when you finally listen to your own discomfort. And how silence can become a decision instead of a habit. It's a story about what happens when professionalism is mistaken for permission. Over the next hour or so, I'm going to walk you through a period of my life that unfolded slowly, almost invisibly at first. There were no sudden explosions, no raised voices, just a series of small, reasonable moments that added up to something undeniable. Moments that taught me how easy it is for environments to normalize disrespect when it's delivered politely, and how quickly people adapt to taking without asking. You'll hear about how I was seen, and more importantly, how I allowed myself to be seen. You'll hear about the internal negotiations we make to stay employed, agreeable, and easy to work with. And you'll hear about the day that balance broke, not because I snapped, but because something finally settled into place. There are parts of this story that are uncomfortable, not because they're extreme, but because they're familiar. If you've ever felt invisible in a room that relied on you, if you've ever sensed a shift before anyone else acknowledged it, this may feel close to home. I won't exaggerate events, and I won't decorate them with anger they didn't contain at the time. I'm telling this as honestly as I can, with the benefit of distance and reflection. What happened to me didn't teach me how to fight louder. It taught me how to stand differently. And while the ending involves consequences, it isn't fueled by bitterness. It's fueled by alignment between what I knew, what I accepted, and what I was finally unwilling to carry. As you listen, I'd like you to hold one question gently in mind. Have you ever stayed quiet, not because you had nothing to say, but because you were waiting to see who would notice? To them, I was reliable in the way furniture is reliable. I don't mean that bitterly. It's just the most accurate comparison I can make now. I was part of the room, always there, always functional, rarely questioned. When I spoke, people listened just enough to keep things moving. When I didn't, no one asked why. My presence was assumed, not considered. At work, I had a title that sounded senior enough to command respect on paper. Senior Operations Manager. It implied authority, oversight, and influence. In reality, it translated to something quieter. The person who made sure nothing broke. The one who remembered how things actually worked. The one who filled in the gaps between departments that didn't speak the same language. I wasn't the face of anything. I was the spine. People described me as calm under pressure. What they meant was that I didn't escalate. I didn't challenge publicly. I didn't force anyone to feel uncomfortable. I absorbed friction so others didn't have to. That skill was praised often, and used constantly. In meetings, I was the one who brought context. I'd gently clarify timelines, rephrase decisions so they made operational sense, and flag risks without attaching names or blame. I learned early that if I framed things as collective concerns rather than personal objections, they were more likely to be accepted. It wasn't manipulation. It was survival. No one ever said I was intimidating. No one said I was difficult. Those labels followed other people, usually louder ones, usually men, usually those who interrupted without apology. I was described as easy to work with, and for a long time I took pride in that. What I didn't realize then was how invisibility compounds. When you consistently make yourself useful without being disruptive, people stop associating your work with effort. They begin to see outcomes as natural, inevitable. Processes run smoothly. That's just how things are. Problems resolved quietly. That's expected. You don't get credit for gravity holding the room together. I noticed it in small ways. My name is missing from the meeting notes where my recommendations were adopted verbatim. Decisions I had cautioned against being framed later as unexpected challenges. Praise delivered indirectly. The ops side handled it well. Never personally. I didn't correct it. Correcting it felt needy, and I had learned to equate need with risk. There was also an assumption that I didn't want more. More visibility, more authority, more voice. Because I hadn't asked loudly, it was decided for me that I was content, that I preferred stability over influence, that I wasn't ambitious in the way ambition was recognized there. The truth was more complicated. I paid attention, constantly. I noticed who spoke last and whose opinion stuck. I noticed how certain people could miss deadlines repeatedly and still be described as strategic, while others hit every mark and were called supportive. I noticed how discomfort was redistributed, how it rolled downhill until it settled on the same shoulders every time, mine included. But I didn't narrate any of this out loud. I didn't journal angrily or vent in hallways. I made notes, literal ones. In a slim black notebook I carried everywhere, under the pretense of organization. Dates, decisions, contradictions. Not because I planned to use them, but because I needed to trust my own memory. When things are subtle, you start to doubt yourself. To them, I was steady. To me, I was alert. There's a difference between being quiet because you have nothing to say and being quiet because you're listening closely. I existed in that second state for years, watching patterns form, watching how quickly people grew comfortable relying on me without acknowledging me, watching how trust was used as a substitute for transparency. If you had asked anyone in that office who I was, they would have said something polite and vague. Blair? Oh, she's great, super dependable, knows everything. And then they would have moved on, confident that whatever needed handling would be handled, by me without further thought. That was who I was to them. And for a long time, I let that be enough. The first time it happened, it was easy to dismiss. It didn't come with an insult or a raised voice. No one crossed a line in a way that would have made a scene. That's why it worked. That's why it stayed with me. We were in a weekly leadership sync. Nothing dramatic, just the usual updates. Product, finance, operations. I had flagged an issue earlier that week, a timeline risk tied to a vendor dependency that hadn't been finalized. I'd laid it out clearly in writing, what could slip, why it mattered, what we needed to decide. When the topic came up in the meeting, the head of product summarized the situation, almost word for word. He spoke confidently, casually, as if the thought had occurred to him in the shower that morning. No one looked at me. The decision that followed mirrored my recommendation exactly. Adjust the rollout, renegotiate the scope, and communicate early. Everyone nodded. Someone said, "That makes sense." Another said, "Good catch." Still, no one looked at me. I told myself it didn't matter. The outcome was right. The work was done. Credit was a secondary concern. I had bills to pay, projects to run, and a reputation for being above politics. Correcting the record would have felt petty, so I let it pass. But something in me noted the sensation, the slight tightening in my chest, the awareness that if I had stayed silent, the risk would still exist. But if I spoke, my voice could be repackaged without attribution. I wrote the date in my notebook that afternoon. Just the date. No commentary. A few weeks later, it happened again. This time, it was a decision that impacted my team directly. A restructuring of responsibilities that would quietly add workload without adding headcount. I was asked for input ahead of time, and I gave it, clearly outlining the trade-offs, the risks to delivery, and the human cost. I suggested an alternative that balanced efficiency with sustainability. In the meeting, that alternative was introduced as a compromise someone else had worked through with ops. Again, no one looked at me. I noticed how smoothly it happened. No malice, no apology, just a seamless absorption of my contribution into someone else's authority. I watched the room accept it without question, and I watched myself nod along, reinforcing the illusion that this was fine. Afterward, a colleague stopped by my desk and said, "Good job handling that. I know it's a lot. Not a great call. Not thanks for pushing back. Just an acknowledgement that I would, as usual, carry the weight quietly." That was the cut. Small enough that it didn't bleed. Clean enough that no one else noticed. But sharp. What unsettled me wasn't the lack of credit. It was the pattern forming beneath it. The way my input was valued was only when detached from my presence. The way my silence was interpreted as consent, and my professionalism as acquiescence. I started paying closer attention, not to outcomes, but to process. Who framed the narrative? Who spoke first? Who summarized at the end? I noticed how often my words entered the room through someone else's mouth. How rarely anyone asked me to speak once they had what they needed. And still, I said nothing. Part of me believed this was just how organizations worked. That fairness was an ideal, not a guarantee. That pushing back on something so subtle would mark me as difficult, insecure, or worse, political. I had spent years building a reputation for being none of those things. So I rationalized. I told myself that visibility wasn't my priority, that my work spoke for itself, that I didn't need recognition to feel secure. I reminded myself of the people who were louder, who clashed openly, who were quietly sidelined later. I told myself I was being smart, but there's a difference between choosing peace and surrendering ground. That difference didn't feel dramatic at the time. It felt like a minor compromise. A small, strategic silence. Something I could afford. I didn't realize then that small cuts don't heal if they keep happening in the same place. They widen, slowly, invisibly, and by the time you feel the damage, everyone else is already used to the shape of you accommodating it. Once something happens twice, your mind starts building a story around it. Not a dramatic one, a practical one. A story that helps you keep functioning without friction. Mine went something like this. This is how it works here. Don't take it personally. Focus on outcomes. That story was very efficient. It allowed me to keep showing up the same way, to keep my tone even, my delivery measured. It let me believe I was choosing maturity over ego. And for a while, it worked. The moments kept coming, but they stayed just subtle enough to ignore. A meeting invite was forwarded to me instead of being sent directly, even though the topic was operational and clearly in my scope. A decision was finalized before I was consulted, followed by a casual, "We'll loop you in on execution." A new hire was introduced as someone who'll work closely with Blair, while being positioned publicly as a strategic lead. Each time I adjusted. I shortened my emails. I softened my language. I framed concerns as questions instead of statements. I reminded myself that my job was to support the business, not my own sense of fairness. I told myself that as long as my team was protected, I could absorb the rest. That's how normalization works. It doesn't ask for permission. It just waits for you to explain it away. What made it harder to challenge was how reasonable everyone sounded. No one was openly dismissive. No one said, "Your input doesn't matter." In fact, people often said the opposite. "We trust you. You're such a safe pair of hands. You always figure it out." Trust, in that environment, meant delegation without authority, responsibility without visibility. It meant being consulted privately and overridden publicly. It meant being relied on, but not reinforced. I began to notice how my silence was being used to stabilize other people's confidence. When someone made a decision they weren't fully sure about, they'd glance at me, not to invite dissent, but to confirm that I wouldn't contradict them. My lack of reaction became a signal. This is fine. And because I didn't interrupt, it became fine. There were moments when I considered speaking up. Not emotionally, just factually. Clarifying authorship, correcting assumptions, reasserting boundaries. But each time, I calculated the cost. Would it derail the meeting? Would it embarrass someone? Would it change anything meaningful or just make me look defensive? I had watched how the organization treated people who disrupted the flow. They were tolerated, then contained, so I stayed rational, calm, useful. I also started doing something else. I stopped expecting better. Expectation is where disappointment begins, and I had learned to manage my disappointment efficiently. I told myself this was a phase, that leadership would eventually notice, that consistency would be rewarded. But consistency, without visibility, doesn't build leverage. It builds dependency. The more indispensable I became, the less I was acknowledged as a decision maker. I was the person people came to after decisions were made, to ask how to make them work. I was the person who smoothed things over when strategies met reality. I was the one who explained unpopular changes to my team, absorbing their frustrations so it didn't travel upward. And I was good at it. That was the most dangerous part. My competence made the imbalance sustainable. My emotional restraint made it invisible. There's a particular loneliness that comes with being the one who understands the full picture, but isn't invited to shape it. You start to feel like you're standing slightly outside your own life, watching yourself perform a role you didn't consciously accept. I didn't feel angry. I felt dulled. The notebook filled slowly. Dates, meeting titles, phrases that were repeated later by someone else. Decisions I was told about instead of being included in. I wasn't collecting evidence with a goal in mind. I was anchoring myself to reality, making sure I wasn't imagining the pattern. Because when disrespect is normalized, the first thing it erodes is your trust in your own perception. I still told myself this was temporary, that every organization has its blind spots, that staying quiet was a form of professionalism, not self-erasure. But deep down, something had shifted. I no longer believed that being patient would lead to being seen. I just hadn't yet admitted what that meant. It became clear to me one afternoon, not during a conflict, but during a compliment. We were wrapping up a quarterly review. Leadership was relaxed, almost cheerful. The numbers were solid. A few tough initiatives had landed without incident. As people logged off the call, my manager smiled and said, "Honestly, Blair, I don't know how we'd function without you. You just make things work." Everyone nodded. Someone laughed lightly. The meeting ended. I sat there for a moment longer than usual, staring at my own reflection in the darkened screen. You just make things work. It sounded generous. It was meant to be. But what I heard underneath it was something else. You are here to absorb complexity so others don't have to. That was the role. I wasn't there to challenge direction. I was there to translate it. I wasn't there to be visible. I was there to be effective. I wasn't there to shape the narrative. I was there to clean it up once it was already told. Reliable, useful, invisible. Once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. I noticed how conversations shifted depending on who was in the room. When executives spoke among themselves, strategy was bold and abstract. When I joined, the language became operational and cautious. Not because I lacked vision, but because I was associated with reality. With constraints. With consequences. I was brought in when something needed grounding, and quietly removed when it needed optimism. There was an unspoken agreement at play. I would not embarrass anyone by pointing out flaws in real time. In return, I would be trusted to handle things. That trust came without authority, but with expectation. And it was framed as respect. The truth was, it was containment. I also realized how often I was used as a buffer. Between leadership and my team. Between ambition and execution. Between decisions and fallout. When people were unhappy, I absorbed it. When things went wrong, I fixed them. When things went right, the credit floated upward. No one told me this was my role. I accepted it by default, one quiet compromise at a time. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from being competent in a space that doesn't fully acknowledge you. It's not burnout, it's erosion. You don't feel overwhelmed. You feel slowly flattened. Your edges soften. Your opinions are dull. You stop offering ideas that might disrupt the smoothness people have come to rely on. I caught myself doing that, editing my thoughts before I spoke, removing anything that might sound like dissent, offering solutions instead of questions. I was playing the part well, and people responded accordingly. They stopped asking what I thought and started telling me what they'd decided. They stopped inviting me to early discussions and looped me in at the end. Not because they didn't value me, but because they had already assigned me a function. I was the executor, the stabilizer, the one who would not rock the boat. The role wasn't malicious. That's what made it dangerous. It was efficient, comfortable, mutually reinforcing. As long as I stayed in it, the system ran smoothly. But roles have a cost. Mine was voice, not all at once, not dramatically, just enough that when something truly mattered, I felt the hesitation before speaking. Just enough that I questioned whether it was my place. Just enough that I delayed, and someone else filled the space. That afternoon, after the call, I opened my notebook and wrote something different. Not a date, not a meeting title. I wrote a sentence. They don't see me as a peer. They see me as a function. It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation. And it carried with it a quiet clarity. Roles persist because they're rewarded. Mine had been rewarded with stability, praise, and the illusion of security. But it had also quietly defined the limits of how I was allowed to exist there. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't announce a change. I didn't even feel angry. I just stopped pretending I hadn't noticed. And that was the beginning of something shifting, not outwardly, but internally. A recalibration, a reassessment of what I was willing to carry simply because it had been handed to me. The day something shifted didn't look important from the outside. There was no argument, no confrontation, no email that made my stomach drop. It was an ordinary Tuesday, folded into a week of ordinary Tuesdays. If you had asked anyone else what happened that day, they would have said nothing at all. That's what made it so decisive. We were in a cross-functional meeting, one of those long, meandering ones where topics blur together, and decisions are made through fatigue rather than clarity. Halfway through, a new initiative was introduced. It had significant operational implications. Timelines, staffing, vendor risk, all the usual fault lines. As the proposal was explained, I felt the familiar instinct rise in me, the urge to step in early, to ask the grounding questions, to save everyone time by pointing out what wouldn't work as framed. I opened my mouth, then I closed it, not because I was afraid, not because I didn't care, but because I suddenly realized something. No one in that room was actually waiting for my input. They were waiting for my compliance. The realization was quiet, but it landed with weight. I watched the conversation continue without me. Assumptions stack on top of assumptions. Optimism fill the gaps where data should have been. Heads nod. Someone says, "Ops can figure that out." And for the first time, instead of stepping in to translate reality, I let the sentence sit there, unchallenged. I felt strangely calm. There was a clarity in that moment that I hadn't felt in years. A recognition that my constant intervention wasn't preventing chaos, it was insulating others from it. I wasn't being consulted because I was respected. I was being relied on because I was predictable. And predictability, I realized, had become a liability. After the meeting, I didn't send a follow-up. I didn't document risks. I didn't propose mitigations. I simply waited. What happened next was subtle, but telling. A few hours later, I received a message. "Hey, can you take a look at the initiative we discussed? Just want to make sure we're not missing anything. Not what do you think? Not should we reconsider? Just make sure we're not missing anything." I stared at the message longer than necessary. I understood then that my role had shifted so completely in their minds that my silence was being treated as a temporary oversight, not a boundary. I replied politely, I said I'd review it and circle back. But internally, something had already changed. For the first time, I didn't feel responsible for fixing what I hadn't been invited to shape. I didn't feel compelled to rescue a process that hadn't respected my presence. I wasn't angry. I was resolved. That evening at home, I opened my notebook and didn't write a date or a meeting title. I wrote a question. What would happen if I stopped cushioning the consequences? It wasn't a threat. It was curiosity. I realized how much emotional labor I had been performing to maintain an equilibrium that didn't serve me. How often I had preemptively solved problems to protect other people from discomfort, at the expense of my own clarity. That day marked the end of something, the end of reflexive accommodation. Not silence as avoidance, silence as choice. I began to notice how often decisions were made around me rather than with me. And instead of rushing to reinsert myself, I observed. I watched how quickly things unraveled without my quiet corrections. How confusion crept in when assumptions went unchecked. No one accused me of disengaging. No one even noticed the change. That, too, was information. Because when you stop compensating for a system's blind spots, the system doesn't thank you. It reveals itself. I didn't confront anyone that week. I didn't ask for recognition or authority. I didn't announce a shift in boundaries. I simply stopped offering what had never been formally requested but always expected. And in that space, where my effort used to live, I felt something unfamiliar but steady. Alignment, not with the organization, with myself. I understood then that whatever came next would require patience. That change wouldn't announce itself loudly. That the consequences of my silence would unfold slowly. But I also knew something else, with absolute certainty. I would never again mistake being needed for being valued. Once silence became a choice, it felt different in my body. Before, it had been a reflex, an automatic smoothing over, a way to keep things moving. Now, it was deliberate, measured, almost surgical. I noticed when I chose not to speak, and I noticed why. Meetings continued as usual. Calendars stayed full. My name was still on every critical process. On the surface, nothing changed. But underneath, my relationship to the room had shifted. I listened more than ever. I paid attention to how often people spoke in placeholders. We'll figure it out. Ops can handle it. We'll adjust as we go. These phrases had always been there, but I had treated them as invitations. Now I heard them as assumptions. And assumptions, I learned, are very comfortable until they're tested. When questions were directed at me, I answered precisely. No more, no less. I stopped volunteering context that hadn't been asked for. I stopped preemptively defending decisions that weren't mine. I stopped translating optimism into feasibility. It wasn't passive-aggressive, it was clean. The effect was immediate, though not obvious. Conversations began looping. People revisited the same points. Decisions took longer. Follow-up meetings multiplied. I watched people grow slightly uneasy, unsure why things felt harder. They mistook my restraint for disengagement. "Everything okay?" my manager asked one afternoon casually, as if checking the weather. "Everything's fine," I said. And it was. What I didn't say was that I was no longer doing invisible labor. I wasn't holding threads together behind the scenes. I wasn't absorbing ambiguity so others could feel decisive. I was letting processes behave as they had been designed, without my quiet corrections. Silence, it turned out, had a way of revealing structure. I also noticed how quickly people filled the space I left. Others began speaking more, asserting more, stepping into operational territory they didn't fully understand. They used confident language. They made commitments. They learned, slowly, what it meant to own consequences. I didn't interrupt them. There was a temptation, at first, to step back in, to prevent mistakes, to protect timelines, to shield my team from downstream chaos. That instinct was strong. It had been trained into me. But each time I paused and asked myself a simple question. Was I invited into this decision, or merely expected to fix it later? If it was the latter, I stayed quiet. This wasn't punishment, it was alignment. And something else began to happen. People started coming to me privately. Not for answers, but for reassurance. Does this plan make sense to you? Am I missing something here? You've been quiet. Any concerns? I answered honestly, but without cushioning. I named risks without framing solutions. I asked clarifying questions instead of offering fixes. I returned ownership to where it belonged. Some people were unsettled by this. Others didn't notice. A few began to adjust. The most telling response came from someone who said lightly, "You seem different lately." I smiled and said nothing, because I was different. Not louder, not colder, just no longer over-functioning in a system that had learned to lean on me. Silence, when chosen, is not absence. It's presence without performance. I started reclaiming energy I hadn't realized I was spending. Evenings felt quieter. My mind felt less cluttered. I wasn't replaying meetings in my head, wondering what I should have said differently. I had said exactly what I meant to say, or nothing at all. That clarity came with consequences. Deadlines slipped, confusion surfaced, a few initiatives stalled. Not catastrophically, but enough to be noticed. Enough that questions started moving upward instead of sideways. And still, no one connected it to me. That was the irony. I had been so central for so long that my withdrawal didn't register as a change. It registered as a problem without a source. I didn't correct that misunderstanding, because for the first time, I understood something fundamental. Silence isn't weakness when you're no longer trying to be liked. It's leverage when you're no longer trying to be indispensable. I wasn't disappearing. I was repositioning, quietly, intentionally. And while no one said it out loud yet, the balance in the room was beginning to shift. Not in my favor, at least not visibly, but away from the comfortable illusion that things just worked. They didn't. They never had. I had. While they were adjusting to the absence of my quiet corrections, I was doing something else entirely. Preparing, not in a dramatic way. There were no late-night schemes or whispered phone calls. No secret folders labeled evidence or exit. What I was doing looked, from the outside, exactly like what I had always done. I was paying attention. What they never noticed was how much I already knew, and how carefully I had been tracking it for years. I knew which processes technically belonged to which teams, and which ones actually lived in the gray space no one wanted to own. I knew where documentation was outdated, where approvals were assumed instead of formalized, where temporary workarounds had quietly become permanent. I knew which reports executives relied on without understanding how they were generated, which metrics were manually reconciled at the last minute, which vendor relationships existed entirely because I maintained them. None of this was secret. That was the point. It was all in plain sight, scattered across systems, emails, shared drives, and meeting notes. Anyone could have learned it. But learning it required patience, curiosity, a willingness to sit with complexity instead of abstracting over it. I had been doing that work for a long time. As my silence continued, I shifted my focus from holding things together to documenting how they were held together. I reviewed contracts I had negotiated years earlier. I revisited decisions that had been framed as collective but executed by me alone. I mapped dependencies, not to expose them, but to understand them fully. What surprised me wasn't how fragile things were. It was how much trust had been placed in continuity rather than clarity. So much of the organization's stability rested on the assumption that I would always be there, that I would always notice the misalignment, that I would always fix it quietly. No one had asked what would happen if that assumption stopped being true. I didn't announce what I was doing. I didn't request additional access or permissions. I worked entirely within my role, my scope, my responsibilities. Everything I touched was something I already owned, formally or informally. I also began keeping my notebook differently. Instead of just dates and moments, I started organizing information, patterns, timelines, ownership gaps. Not to build a case against anyone, but to build a clear picture for myself. I wanted to understand the system as it truly was, not as it was described in decks and all-hands meetings. Clarity is a form of power, but only if you're willing to look at what it reveals. What it revealed, slowly, was leverage. Not in the manipulative sense, in the structural sense. I realized that my value had never been just execution. It had been continuity, memory, context, the unglamorous connective tissue that allowed others to operate confidently without understanding the full terrain. And I realized something else, too. None of that was protected, not by redundancy, not by documentation, not by shared ownership. The organization had grown comfortable relying on me not because it was strategic, but because it was easy. That ease had come at my expense. I began to formalize what had always been informal. I updated process documents, but neutrally, factually, without commentary. I clarified ownership in writing. I asked questions in emails instead of solving problems in DMs. I made decisions traceable. No one objected. Why would they? Transparency sounds like a virtue. What they didn't see was that I was removing myself from the role of silent interpreter. I was making the system legible without making myself indispensable. At the same time, I started having quiet conversations with myself. I asked what I wanted my work to feel like, what kind of authority I was willing to operate under, what kind of cost I was no longer willing to pay for stability. These weren't emotional questions. They were practical ones. And the answers were clear. I wasn't interested in fighting for recognition in a structure that benefited from my invisibility. I wasn't interested in performing loyalty to a system that hadn't reciprocated it. I wasn't interested in being the last line of defense for decisions I hadn't been allowed to shape. The more I clarified this internally, the calmer I became. From the outside, I was still composed, still professional, still reliable. But something essential had changed. I was no longer emotionally invested in being needed. That shift freed up enormous energy. I stopped anticipating crises before they happened. I stopped cushioning impact. I stopped smoothing egos. I let the organization experience itself more honestly. And in doing so, I learned exactly where my leverage lived. Not in secrets, not in sabotage, but in understanding. Understanding how things actually worked. Understanding what assumptions were being made. Understanding how much of the system's confidence rested on a single, quiet presence. They never noticed me preparing because preparation, when done ethically, looks like competence. And I had been competent for a very long time. The reveal wasn't dramatic. There was no moment where everything clicked at once. No sudden rush of triumph or fear. It arrived the way most truths do. Quietly, after enough evidence accumulates that denial becomes impractical. I was reviewing a routine quarterly report late one afternoon. It was one of those documents leadership referenced often but rarely questioned. Clean charts, confident summaries. It told a reassuring story. As I traced one of the numbers back to its source, I noticed something I had always known but never articulated. The data pipeline depended on a series of manual reconciliations that lived entirely with me. Not officially, not in any job description, but in practice. I followed the thread further. The report pulled from a dashboard that required a custom logic layer I had built years earlier to compensate for system gaps. That logic depended on assumptions that hadn't been revisited since before the company doubled in size. Those assumptions were never documented because, at the time, I was sitting in the room and adjusting them as needed. I leaned back in my chair and felt something settle. This wasn't negligence. It was trust. Misplaced, unexamined trust. And it wasn't just this report. Once I saw it everywhere. Vendor escalations that defaulted to me because relationships were personal, not institutional. Regulatory checks that relied on my historical knowledge of how we've always done it. Launch readiness calls where my quiet nod had functioned as approval, even when I wasn't the decision maker. I wasn't a gatekeeper by design. I was one by accumulation. The private reveal wasn't that the organization needed me. I had known that. The reveal was how it needed me, and how little of that dependency was acknowledged, shared, or protected. If I were gone tomorrow, nothing would break immediately. That was the illusion. Things would keep moving. For a while. And then small inconsistencies would appear. Numbers wouldn't reconcile. Commitments would conflict. people would realize they were relying on confidence without context. It wouldn't be catastrophic. It would be expensive. I didn't feel satisfaction in that realization. I felt responsibility, not to the company, but to myself. I understood then that leverage doesn't require intent. It's often created when competence meets neglect. When systems grow faster than governance. When reliability is rewarded instead of examined. I closed the report and didn't make any changes. Instead, I asked myself a harder question. What am I willing to continue carrying without authority? The answer was simple: nothing. That clarity didn't make me reckless. It made me precise. Over the next few weeks, I continued doing my job. Fully, ethically, without withholding. But I stopped being the silent backstop. I stopped absorbing risk that wasn't mine to own. I let questions surface where answers used to be implied. I also did something else, privately. I reviewed my employment agreement, my role definition, my access scope, my obligations. Not because I planned to leave, but because I wanted to understand the boundaries clearly. Leverage without clarity is just resentment. I had no interest in that. Everything I had built belonged to the company. I was clear on that. But the understanding, the context, the judgment, those lived with me. And I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't afraid to lose the job, not because I had something else lined up, not because I was financially reckless, but because the cost of staying misaligned had begun to outweigh the cost of change. That realization brought an unexpected calm. I stopped imagining future scenarios where I would finally be recognized, finally included, finally asked. I stopped waiting for the system to correct itself. Systems don't do that. People do, or they don't. The private reveal wasn't about power over others. It was about power over my own next move. I knew now that if I stayed, it would be on different terms. And if those terms weren't possible, I would leave without spectacle, without bitterness, without burning anything down. Leverage, when understood clearly, doesn't demand action. It offers options. I didn't tell anyone what I had realized. I didn't hint. I didn't test reactions. There was no advantage in that. Some truths are meant to stay private, not because they're dangerous, but because they're grounding. This one grounded me completely, and from that point on, every decision I made was informed by a single, steady awareness. I was no longer guessing where I stood. Once you see clearly, you don't unsee. The decision point didn't arrive as a deadline or an ultimatum. No one forced my hand. In fact, the organization offered me exactly what it always had: stability, polite praise, and the expectation that I would continue smoothing the edges of decisions I didn't shape. What changed was my willingness to accept that trade. I began laying out my options, not emotionally, but structurally. I wrote them down the same way I approached work, cleanly, without drama. Option 1 was to stay as I was. Continue performing the role assigned to me. Maintain the quiet influence without formal authority. Protect my team. Keep the machine running. This option came with predictability and a slow, steady cost. Continued erosion of voice, ownership without power, and the understanding that nothing fundamental would shift unless I made noise I wasn't interested in making. Option 2 was to fight internally. Ask for recognition. Formalize authority. Push for a seat that matched the responsibility I already carried. This option sounded reasonable on paper, but I knew the terrain. It would require me to argue for my worth in a system that benefited from not acknowledging it. Even if I won, I would be marked, framed as political, disruptive, harder to trust. Option 3 was to disengage strategically. Not immediately leave, not sabotage, not withdraw effort, but stop compensating. Let the system experience the consequences of its own design. This option required patience and emotional discipline. It also came with risk. Systems don't like mirrors. Option 4 was to exit. Cleanly. Quietly. On my own timeline. I didn't rush the decision. Rushing would have been a tell, a sign of emotion, of reaction. I wanted whatever I chose to be irreversible because it was aligned, not because it was dramatic. For weeks, I held all four options lightly. I observed how leadership responded to growing friction, whether curiosity emerged, whether accountability shifted, whether anyone asked different questions. They didn't. What I saw instead was a familiar pattern: confusion traveling downward, pressure traveling sideways, and reassurance traveling upward. And in the middle of it all, a continued assumption that I would step in if things got too uncomfortable. That assumption made the decision for me. I realized that staying without change wasn't neutrality, it was consent. And fighting for change inside a structure that didn't want to examine itself would cost me more than leaving it. So I chose the irreversible option, not the loudest one, the cleanest one. I decided that I would stop positioning myself as the solution to problems I didn't own. I would continue doing my job with integrity, but I would no longer anchor a system that refused to anchor me. And if that led to an outcome I couldn't control, I would accept it. This wasn't resignation, it was alignment. I didn't announce my decision. I didn't update my resume that day. I didn't tell friends or colleagues. The decision lived quietly inside me, steady and settled. Something interesting happens when you make a decision you're not afraid of. You become very calm. Meetings stopped feeling charged. Emails stopped carrying weight. I no longer read between the lines, searching for signals. I already knew what I needed to know. I also stopped offering preemptive reassurance. When asked if something would be ready, I answered honestly, based on scope and ownership. When asked to just handle something outside my authority, I asked who owned the decision. When timelines were unrealistic, I named the constraint without proposing a workaround. None of this was confrontational. It was factual. The system didn't like that, but systems rarely announce their discomfort directly. They escalate quietly. They test. They look for compliance disguised as collaboration. I noticed the tests, and I didn't pass them. By the time the next all-hands meeting was scheduled, I had already made peace with whatever came next. Not because I knew the outcome, but because I had chosen myself over the role I had been assigned without consent. There's a particular kind of strength that comes from knowing you're done negotiating internally. Whatever happened after that wouldn't define me. It would simply reveal the truth of the structure I was standing in. Once the decision was made, I moved differently. Not outwardly, not in any way that would have drawn attention, but internally, everything was measured against a new standard. Does this require me to protect a system that has not protected me? If the answer was no, I did only what was required. Clearly. Cleanly. Documented. Moving in silence doesn't mean disappearing. It means acting without explanation, without rehearsal, without emotional leakage. I continued to attend every meeting. I delivered on every commitment that was formally mine. I kept my tone neutral, my language precise. What I stopped doing was improvising. I no longer patched gaps that hadn't been acknowledged. I no longer volunteered to take this offline. I no longer smoothed conflicts that leadership preferred not to see. If something wasn't clear, I asked for clarity in writing. If ownership was ambiguous, I named that ambiguity and waited. This had a subtle but immediate effect. Emails grew longer. CC lists expanded. People began looping in legal, finance, compliance, functions they hadn't needed before because I had quietly served as the connective tissue between them. The system was becoming more expensive, more procedural. That wasn't my goal. It was the result. Behind the scenes, I took care of my own foundations. I reviewed my finances, not to prepare for disaster, but to understand my runway. I made sure I could afford patience. I updated personal records. I reconnected with a former mentor, not to complain, but to reality check my thinking. I didn't ask for advice. I asked questions. What does aligned work look like at this stage of a career? How do you recognize when it's time to step away without burning bridges? What do you owe an organization and what do you not? The answers were consistent. You owe integrity, not self-erasure. I also began to notice how much of my stress had been anticipatory. I had spent years bracing for problems before they happened. Now, I let them arrive in their own time. I responded, but I didn't preempt. That shift alone changed my days. Leadership, for their part, sensed movement without being able to locate it. I received more check-ins. More just wanted to align messages. My manager asked about my engagement, using the word carefully, as if it were a temperature reading. I told the truth. I am focused on my scope and delivering what I own. It wasn't a refusal. It was a boundary. There's a moment in every system where quiet resistance becomes visible, not because someone is loud, but because they're no longer compensating. That moment was approaching, and I could feel it. Still, I didn't rush. I knew that if something came, it would come quickly. Systems don't tolerate ambiguity for long. They either adapt or they excise what they can't control. I wasn't trying to be untouchable. I was trying to be whole. And then, one morning, a meeting invite appeared on my calendar. A company-wide meeting. Mandatory. Short agenda. Scheduled during a window that was usually reserved for operational reviews. The subject line was neutral to the point of being opaque. I felt no spike of anxiety, just recognition. I reviewed my calendar. I confirmed my notes. I made sure everything I owned was documented and accessible. Appropriately. Professionally. I did not download anything that wasn't mine to take. I did not forward anything externally. There was no scrambling. When you move in silence long enough, you don't fear noise. You expect it. As I joined the meeting, faces filled the screen. Some familiar, some carefully composed. Leadership spoke in generalities. Words like alignment, efficiency, restructuring. The kind of language that sounds reasonable because it avoids specifics. Halfway through the meeting, as someone was explaining organizational focus, my screen flickered. A new email arrived. The subject line was my name. I opened it without changing my expression. It was brief, polite, final. I was being terminated, effective immediately, by email. While I was still sitting in the company meeting, before I could even process the words fully, another notification appeared. Access revoked. Systems logging me out one by one, Slack disconnected, internal tools gone. My access was cut before the meeting even ended. No announcement, no acknowledgement, just a quiet removal, executed with procedural efficiency. I stayed in the meeting until it concluded. Camera on, face neutral. No one mentioned my name. No one noticed when I disappeared at the end. When the call ended, I closed my laptop and sat very still. I wasn't shocked. I was confirmed. The consequences didn't announce themselves right away. There was no immediate fallout, no panicked messages, no sudden scramble that I could see. I was already locked out by then, cut cleanly from the system, the way you sever power to a room and expect the lights to stay off. For the first few hours, I was invisible again. This time by design. I went for a walk, not to clear my head, but to give my body time to catch up with what my mind had already accepted. I noticed how quiet everything felt when I wasn't carrying the low-grade hum of responsibility. I noticed how my shoulders dropped without permission. How hunger returned. How time slowed. That night, I slept deeply. The next morning, the consequences began. Not for me, but around me. I learned about them indirectly, through the only channels still open. People. A former colleague texted to ask if I was okay. Another sent a vague message. Heard something strange yesterday. Call me when you can. A third simply wrote, they're asking questions. At first, the questions were small. Where is the latest version of the vendor escalation framework? Who approves changes to the reconciliation logic? Why does this report not match the dashboard anymore? People assumed the answers were somewhere. In a folder. In an email thread. In a shared drive they hadn't looked at yet. They didn't assume the answers had been contextual, adaptive, held together by judgment rather than documentation. Leadership reassured everyone. We have coverage. Managers repeated it. We'll figure it out. But what happens when figuring it out had always meant calling the same person? That absence doesn't show up as a single failure. It shows up as friction, delay, cost. Meetings multiplied. Consultants were mentioned. Legal was looped in on issues that had once been resolved in a quiet conversation. Decisions slowed, because no one could confidently say how a change would ripple through the system. And no one could say it because no one had ever needed to. What they felt first wasn't loss, it was uncertainty. Uncertainty irritates organizations more than problems do. Problems can be assigned. Uncertainty lingers. Within a week, I heard that a major initiative had been paused. Not canceled, paused, pending operational clarity. Another had moved forward and then backtracked after inconsistencies surfaced in reporting. Nothing catastrophic, just inefficient. Expensive. No one said my name in public forums. That would have implied dependence. Instead, people spoke about process gaps and transition issues. Language did what it always does. It softened reality. Privately, though, the tone was different. People reached out carefully. Some with guilt. Some with confusion. A few with quiet respect. They asked what I thought would happen next. I told them the truth. It will stabilize eventually, I said. Just not the way it did before. I wasn't being coy. I meant it. Systems always adapt. They just reveal what they value in the process. What struck me most was how quickly my departure was reframed as a logistical problem instead of a human one. Not out of cruelty, out of habit. It was easier to talk about missing documentation than missing judgment. Easier to invest in tools than to examine why one person had been allowed to hold so much context alone. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt distant. There's a strange emotional shift that happens when consequences unfold without your involvement. You don't feel powerful. You feel unburdened. I wasn't watching for collapse. I wasn't hoping for regret. I had already let go of the need to be proven right. What I felt instead was confirmation, not of my importance, but of my decision. The organization did what organizations do. It redistributed work, hired support, formalized processes it had postponed formalizing. It spent money to replace continuity with structure. That's not failure, that's cost. And cost is only visible once the subsidy is removed. I was the subsidy. Not intentionally, not heroically, just quietly, over time. As weeks passed, the urgency faded. Things settled into a new, less elegant rhythm. People adjusted. They always do. And I adjusted too. I noticed how little of my identity had been tied to the job once the noise fell away. How much space there was when I wasn't bracing for the next invisible demand. How easily my attention returned to things I had postponed. Reading without distraction. Conversations without urgency. Thoughts that weren't immediately operationalized. I also noticed something else. No one asked me to come back. Not officially. Not informally. Because asking would have required acknowledging what had been lost. And why. The consequences had begun, but not as punishment. As reality. By the time anyone tried to fix it, the shape of the problem had already changed. At first, the organization treated the disruption as temporary, an adjustment period. New names appeared next to responsibilities I used to hold. External consultants were brought in with impressive titles and neatly packaged frameworks. There were town halls about resilience, adaptability, growth. All the right words. But underneath the language, something else was happening. The questions were no longer about what had gone wrong. They were about why no one had seen it coming. That's when panic begins. Not loud panic, but managerial panic. The kind that hides behind urgency and polite emails marked high priority. I heard about it through fragments. A senior leader asking why certain numbers no longer lined up month over month. A director frustrated that decisions kept looping back for review. A vendor escalating directly to legal because the informal channel they trusted no longer existed. None of this pointed back to me explicitly. That would have been too uncomfortable. Instead, the narrative shifted toward transition oversight, as if what had been lost were a checklist, not a person. Then came the calls. Not from leadership at first, from people one layer down, those who felt the friction most directly. They asked if I remembered how something used to be handled, if I had notes, if I could sanity check a process they were now responsible for. I was careful. I answered general questions. I pointed them to documentation that existed. I didn't recreate context from memory. I didn't reinsert myself as an informal advisor. Not because I was bitter, but because I understood the risk. Once you step back into a system that hasn't changed its assumptions, you become the workaround again. And I was done being that. Eventually, leadership reached out. The message was polite, neutral, framed as curiosity. "We're doing a review of operational continuity," it said. "We'd value your perspective on where things might have broken down." I read it twice. This was the moment people imagine when they talk about leverage. The chance to re-enter the room, to explain, to be validated retroactively, to finally be seen. But what struck me wasn't temptation, it was timing. They weren't asking why I had left. They weren't asking what I had experienced. They were asking how to restore what had been lost, without examining the conditions that caused it. It was too late for that. I declined the meeting. Not dramatically, just clearly. I thanked them for reaching out and said I didn't feel I could add value without re-entering a structure I had chosen to step away from. That was the truth. You can't retrofit respect after removal. You can't reframe dependency as collaboration once the cost is exposed. And you can't ask someone to help fix a system that never asked them how it was built. What followed was a brief silence, then a different message. More direct. An offer to consult. Short term. Clearly compensated. I understood what it was. An attempt to buy back continuity without re-examining authority. To solve the problem without changing the pattern. I declined again. That's when it became clear. Fixing it would require acknowledging that something essential had been taken for granted. And acknowledgement would require humility. Not just from individuals, but from the structure itself. Structures resist that. By then, new norms were already forming. Work was slower, more documented, less intuitive. People complained quietly about inefficiency while reassuring each other that this was just the cost of scale. They were right, but they were also avoiding a deeper truth. Scale without respect creates fragility. Not immediately, gradually. I didn't take pleasure in watching this from afar. Distance has a way of stripping things of drama. What remained was a sober understanding. Nothing that was happening was personal. And that's why it couldn't be fixed. The system had done exactly what it was designed to do. It removed what it couldn't comfortably acknowledge and absorbed the cost later. That's not cruelty. That's inertia. By the time regret appeared, if it did at all, it was diffused. No single decision to reverse. No apology to offer. No person left to reinstate. Only a quieter, heavier machine. And me, outside of it, whole. The confrontation, when it finally happened, was almost disappointing in its simplicity. There was no showdown, no raised voices, no moment where I said the thing I'd been rehearsing in my head for years. Because I hadn't been rehearsing anything at all. It came as a request. A senior leader asked if I'd be willing to meet for coffee. Not to consult, not to fix anything, just to talk. I agreed. Not because I needed closure, but because I was curious. Curiosity, I'd learned, was safer than expectation. We met in a quiet cafe near my old office. Neutral ground. They arrived a few minutes late, slightly flustered, carrying the faint tension of someone who knows they're stepping into a conversation without a script. We exchanged pleasantries. Weather, traffic, the usual soft edges. Then they said, "I wanted to understand your perspective." I nodded. I didn't rush to fill the silence. They spoke first. About how quickly things had changed. About how complex the organization had become. About how hard it was to see everything at once. The words were careful, professional. Not defensive, but not vulnerable either. I listened. When they finished, they waited. I could feel it. The expectation that I would finally explain myself. That I would outline the pattern. Name the moments. Translate my experience into something actionable. I didn't. Instead, I said something very simple. I did my job as it was designed. They looked at me, slightly confused. I owned what I was given. I continued. And over time, I was given more responsibility without authority. I adapted. Quietly. Until I couldn't do that anymore without losing alignment with myself. There was no accusation in my voice. No edge, just facts. They asked if there was something they could have done differently. I thought about it. Not long, but honestly. "Yes," I said. "You could have asked earlier. Not what I was handling, but how. Not whether things were working, but who they were working through. They nodded slowly. I could see the calculation happening, where to place this insight, how to integrate it without destabilizing too much. Then came the question I had expected. Would you ever consider coming back? I didn't answer immediately. Not for effect. Just because the answer deserved clarity. No, I said finally. Not to that version of the role. There it was. The line, clean, unemotional. They asked why. Because that role required me to disappear in order to function, I said. And I'm not willing to do that anymore. Silence settled between us. Not awkward, but heavy. The kind of silence that doesn't demand to be filled. They thanked me for my honesty. I thanked them for the conversation. That was it. No apology, no defense, no grand resolution. And that was enough. What struck me afterward wasn't what was said, but what wasn't. There was no attempt to minimize my experience. No effort to reframe it as misunderstanding. But there was also no promise of change. That told me everything. Confrontation doesn't always bring transformation. Sometimes it just confirms distance. I walked away from that cafe feeling lighter. Not because I had been vindicated, but because I hadn't compromised myself to be understood. I hadn't softened the truth to make it easier to digest. I hadn't asked for recognition that came too late. I had simply spoken from where I stood, and where I stood was no longer inside the system that had shaped me. There's a quiet power in realizing you don't need the other person to agree with you for your truth to stand. That you don't need a dramatic ending for something to be complete. The confrontation didn't change them. It didn't need to. It clarified me. Who I am now is quieter than who I used to be. Not externally. I still speak when I need to, still lead conversations, still make decisions. But internally, there's less noise, less negotiation, less second-guessing about whether my presence is too much or not enough. For a long time, my identity was built around being competent in difficult spaces, being the one who could hold complexity without flinching, being steady, being useful. Those traits weren't false, but they were incomplete. They were shaped by an environment that rewarded self-containment over self-expression. Now my work looks different. Not dramatically so, but intentionally. I choose roles where authority and responsibility are aligned, where expectations are explicit, where silence is an option, not a requirement. I pay close attention to how decisions are made, not just what decisions are made. If I'm invited late into a conversation, I ask why. If ownership is unclear, I clarify it early. If my role begins to drift toward invisibility, I correct course. I don't wait for patterns to repeat anymore. That doesn't mean I'm rigid. It means I'm awake. What surprised me most after leaving wasn't how quickly I adapted. It was how little I missed the old version of myself. The one who smoothed over discomfort before anyone else had to feel it. The one who translated vague authority into concrete action without acknowledgement. I had mistaken that self for maturity. Now I understand it was endurance. Endurance has its place, but it isn't a life strategy. I'm still calm under pressure, still observant, still methodical. But those qualities are no longer offered freely, without context. They're shared within structures that recognize them as contributions, not conveniences. There's also more space in me now, for curiosity, for reflection, for choosing rather than reacting. I no longer feel the need to anticipate everyone else's needs before my own. That shift alone has changed how I move through rooms. People notice me differently, not because I'm louder, but because I'm clearer. And clarity carries weight. I don't tell this story as a warning or a triumph. I tell it because so many people live in roles they never consciously accepted, absorbing costs that aren't visible until they leave. Because quiet competence is often mistaken for infinite capacity. Because professionalism can become a trap if it's not paired with boundaries. I don't regret staying as long as I did. I learned how systems work, how power hides, how silence can protect, and how it can erode. I learned how to leave without burning anything down, and how to stand without needing to be seen by everyone. Most importantly, I learned that alignment isn't loud. It's steady. It's waking up without bracing. It's making decisions without rehearsing justifications. It's knowing when something no longer fits and trusting yourself enough to step away. Who I am now is someone who listens closely to rooms, to patterns, to myself. And when I choose silence, it's not because I've been overlooked. It's because I've already decided where I belong. There's a moral to this story, but it isn't the kind that fits neatly into a slogan. It isn't know your worth or don't let them use you. Those ideas are too simple for how these situations actually unfold. No one wakes up one day and decides to disappear inside their own life. It happens gradually, through reason, professionalism, and the desire to keep things working. The real lesson is quieter. Systems don't exploit people by being cruel. They do it by being comfortable. They learn who will absorb pressure without complaint, who will adapt without asking for authority, who will make things work even when the design is flawed. And once that learning sets in, it's very hard to undo. Not because people are bad, but because incentives are lazy. If you are capable and calm, you will be leaned on. If you are silent and reliable, you will be assumed. If you do not interrupt, you will be built around. None of that is personal, and that's why it's dangerous. What protected me in the end wasn't confrontation or revenge. It was clarity. The moment I stopped negotiating internally, stopped asking myself to endure what I wouldn't advise someone else to endure, the outcome became inevitable. I didn't win, they didn't lose. The system simply revealed what it valued when the subsidy was removed. And here's the part that matters most. You don't need to be fired by email while sitting in a company meeting for this story to apply to you. You don't need your access cut before the meeting even ends. Most people never get a moment that clean, that final. Most people stay. They stay because the disrespect is subtle, because the costs are invisible, because leaving feels louder than enduring, because they've been told, directly or indirectly, that being agreeable is the same as being mature. It isn't. Maturity is knowing when silence is strategic and when it's erasing you. Quiet dominance isn't about withholding or punishing. It's about choosing alignment over accommodation. It's about understanding that your calm, your competence, your patience are not infinite resources to be drawn from without consent. And it's about recognizing the moment when staying starts to cost you more than leaving ever could. I didn't tell this story to position myself as exceptional. I told it because it's common, and because it often goes unnamed. Because many of you listening are probably carrying more than your role requires, smoothing more than your title suggests, waiting for recognition that may never come. If this resonated, I don't want you to ask yourself, should I quit? That's not the question. The question is quieter and harder. Where in your life have you been silent not because it was wise, but because it was expected? I'll leave you with that. If you're comfortable, share your thoughts in the comments. Not just what happened, but what you noticed, what you're carrying, or what shifted for you while listening. Sometimes naming it is the first form of power.